Okay, I'm gonna start to admit the first group of students in. There's 8 so far.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we can give it about like 1 or 2 more minutes before we get started. Welcome. I'm pretty sure an email was sent out, but today I'll both well, me and Nubira will both be here for your wellness session. And then I'll also be doing your content session on organ systems right after this. For the most part today, it'll be relatively calm. Like this is all about debriefing, kind of like getting into just kind of think of it as like a very low stress, low stakes time where you can ask questions, you can get to know me and Nubira a lot better in terms of like how we're going to be as test prep consultants, our experience with the MCAT, and we're going to run through a guide that I put together that was largely just that I put together largely right after I got my score back and things that I was like, okay, this is what worked the best for me. And we'll also hear from Nubira's experience because we actually studied at completely different times and have very different stories that I think both people, like anyone can benefit from depending on what their studying timeline is going to look like. So now that we're at 6:03, we can kind of get started.
And while Angel pulls up the doc, I'll just mention that like we said, this is very chill. So if you have questions at any point, you can like put them in the chat, unmute, whatever. Like we want you guys to participate as well. So if we're talking about something and you want to know more or we didn't elaborate enough, like feel free to jump in at any point. We want this to be as meaningful for you as possible.
Okay, maybe make this full screen. Can everybody see that well? Okay. Okay. So my name is Angel. And I called this the study plan and guide for the lazy and poor but ambitious as kind of like a joke, but also low key serious. Just because going about my process, I was kind of lazy. And I was financially disadvantaged. So I was making my way through with minimal funds, not no funds, though, but minimal funds. And I was ambitious. I did come out of the back as soon as before I even knew what like it meant to score 500. I was saying I was going to score 520. So the ambition was also there. And that ambition is something I actually like to coin and call delusional confidence, which is something you'll hear me mention throughout this entire, like as I scroll through this, because largely it's something that I feel like is really important and really like kind of guides your like journey towards medicine because you do have to be a little bit delusional to think that, oh my gosh, me, a single human being, can actually help this other sick single human being and stop them from being sick. It's a bit of a crazy thing when you actually put it into words. When you actually try and wrap your head around what is someone doing when they're a medical doctor, doesn't sound normal. So you're got to be a tad bit delusional. But another thing I'll also mention as we go through this is how, with just as much delusion and confidence you need to have, you also need to have enough humility and a good amount of healthy anxiety to actually take and follow that journey and make sure that it's like each step you're taking is pushing you further and further towards the place like you want to be at. And like you're not overestimating yourself, you're not putting unnecessary like boundaries that you absolutely have to reach. You're not setting unnecessarily high goals, but that you have confidence, like you're also being realistic. So, starting off just in the beginning, so my score distribution, I had a 130, 129, and then a 131 and 131. And that was for Chem Phys, Cars, Bio, Biochem, and Psych Soc. So my total was a 521. I studied for about 4 months and I started with the the free blueprint diagnostic. And I started with the free blueprint diagnostic. It's something I always recommend, not just because I work with Blueprint, but also because of the fact that one, it's free, and two, it's a half length. So it's only half the length of an actual MCAT exam. So it's a nice thing to start off with without trying to like figure out, okay, how am I going to squeeze 8 hours into my day? It's a lot harder to be like, oh, it's 4 hours. I just don't have time for this, than 8 hours, which is kind of easy to say, oh, I don't have time for this today. um, and my diagnostic was a 499. So I had a 22-point score increase. I studied for about 4 months. I studied throughout I kind of started, I think, the week of or the week before the start of spring semester. And I took my exam actually during finals week. So if anyone has any questions about navigating being a student and applying to medical school, oh, not applying to medical school, being a student and studying for the MCAT, I absolutely can talk more about that. Or even just like, oh, how do you manage taking the MCAT and finals? You can kind of think of it as just like as like a long final like you have to do. It honestly felt like just another test. Um, And that was my main journey. I also did some other things while I was a student and studying for the MCAT. I was in 2 labs and I was also volunteering throughout the entire time up until about a month before my exam, where I was like, oh, my exam is right around the corner and I've barely studied. So, New Byra, what was your experience like? What was your
Yeah, so as Angel said before, ours were like pretty different experiences. I was basically in all of your shoes a year ago. I took my MCAT on the 27th of January, 2023. But I pretty much only studied for a month. Like, I told myself I'd study during the fall semester, but it was very chaotic and hectic. So I really only started studying after my finals. So I'd say like December 24th until like up to the day before, like January 26th. So about a month of studying. I ended up scoring a 520, a little bit different on distribution. I think it was 132 Chem Phys, 129 on Cars and Psych Soc, and then 130 on Bio. And my diagnostic was one of the AAMC ones, so it was like unscored, but you can like online try to convert it, and I think it was like a 507 or something. So same situation where it was like definitely an uphill battle. And I think that in terms of like having the 1 month, the advice I'd give and what I'd say about that is like, it's not impossible, obviously, but definitely manage your time, like set up a schedule, know that you have like a limited amount of days. Like what I've seen from my friends who studied over the summer, over like 3-4 months, they've had a lot more time, or like they could take gaps and stuff. Me personally, when I studied over intersession, I had nothing else going on, like no intersession classes, no lab or anything. So it was like full time of a month, which I think can kind of equate to like 3 months of when people are kind of part-time studying. So if you're able to kind of like keep your attention for that long and do it, then I think it is possible. Also, but still be sure to like take breaks in between. Like there were some days where truly I was like, don't get burnt out by like going full time every day. So like take some time for yourself as well. But that was pretty much my situation. taking the test. So if anyone has questions, if you guys are in the same boat, because this is like the intersession class, feel free to send any questions.
Yeah, just drop anything in the chat. I don't know if we have a Q&A, but if there's also a Q&A, feel free to drop it in the Q&A. We will get to them before the end. Wow, that's honestly quite impressive. I don't think I could do a month of full-time studying. I think it would break me. I would have a solid week in me before I'd be like, wow. Okay, so for the rest of the guide, it kind of includes resources that I used to study, the resources I recommend, and then general tips. And then some high yield topics that I encountered on my exam, and then some day of the test taking strategy tips, because I like to think I'm a very comfortable, I tend to be a very comfortable, nope, we have some hands. I'm a comfortable test taker. So I would say, okay, before we move into resources, then we can answer some questions.
I think the hands might be just like in the chat. I think those are the people taking it in January.
Oh, okay.
But in the meantime, we do have some questions. I took the MCAT during my junior intersession. So I'm currently a senior at Hopkins. Actually, maybe we should introduce ourselves. I think we did in the intro, but just like a little more background. I'm majoring in Chem BE. I'm currently a senior, also applying this cycle. So I took it last year in my junior intersession.
I took the MCAT I studied my junior spring. And I graduated a semester early, so I've been out of, that was a year ago, pretty much a year ago today, I started studying. Nope, 2 years ago today I started studying. Sorry, timeline. I majored in neuroscience on a systems focus at Hopkins. I loved it. I'm a huge Hopkins neuro supporter. Now I'm currently working in their department of neurosurgery over on the medical campus as a research tech, and I am also applying this cycle. So that's what I'm doing.
Another question in the chat I got like privately was, what should you prioritize if you only have a month? Yeah, I definitely think strategy is important, and Angel and I will get into it later as well. But know your strengths. Like, I can't give you the answer directly, but like think about what you already know. Like, it might be like, for me, for example, I knew my physics background was strong. Let's say like my biochem or my psych soc was like definitely weak. So like know that and go into it, and maybe not practice the things that you're already kind of strong in. And your practice test will really help guide you on that as well. Look at your like section scores. Don't just treat it as like a whole score, and think about like, where do I really need to put this attention? As they said in the chat, like the diagnostic and stuff. Really use your test to inform what you need to study next, since you probably won't have enough time to really like delve into every small topic. So also think about what's high yield. We'll also get into that over the course of the session.
Yes, like 100% agree. Knowing what your strengths and weaknesses are is something we're really going to talk about, because it's going to be one of the most important things. I think that was when my score started to shoot up, when I started to actually pay attention to things I wasn't good at rather than ignoring them and trying to really bolster my the things I felt that I was naturally good at. I was like, the biggest one was cars. Like my cars score actually did not go up until my like actual test day, when it went up to a 129. So, and that was because my last like practice exam I took was about a month before my exam. And then I did a big like cars overhaul when I think I got a 126 on my practice exam. And I was like, okay, I think I need to figure out what's going on. And okay, we'll do one more question and then continue on. Did you both all have your prereqs completed before studying and taking the MCAT? I kind of curated my final semester study schedule to like kind of like supplement my studying. So all of the classes I took, because I knew that I was going to be taking the MCAT like during or at the end, all of the classes I took pertained towards the MCAT. Um, in terms of like general like pre-med prerequisites, I think the only one I didn't have completed at that time was genetics, but I don't think I'm not sure if that's an exact prereq or if it's more of like something that you can take. But genetics was the only thing that I was taking actively as a prereq that I think while I was studying. Other than that, I had taken like all of the rest like just beforehand. Like I think I just finished physics 2 and biochemistry the semester before.
For me, I'd done all my prereqs in the sense like I'd taken biochem or go 1 and 2, but some of the more foundational things I never had to take like gen bio in college, and then I skipped out of gen chem and just did applied chem. So I was relying on my like AP high school like bio and chem notes a bit. But another thing was like I took social psych, and I think that was my only psych social class at the time I took the MCAT. So I will say like there's a lot of sections of psychology that are covered, so like it's good to have the background in those classes, but you will have to expand. So like I didn't have intro psych or like other types of psych that came up, and then I didn't have sociology. But you can also like get that content from the books and resources, so that's also all right.
Yes. And neuroscience truly does not supplement psychology. As you can see from my diagnostic psych social score, I took this, I think about a month after the semester fall semester had ended, and it was still that and cars were both my lowest ones. And I never took an English class at Hopkins beyond fiction and poetry. And I never took a psychology course there. I did take a cognitive neuroscience class, but that was about it. So those kind of things end up being like you'll have to do a deep dive. And also, like New Byra said, I never took biology at Hopkins. I did that in high school. So having to kind of reteach yourself those things there's like good things and bad things about it. Like there's good things in terms of it's like all you have to learn is the things that you need to know for the MCAT, and you don't have a whole bunch of other things that you would need to know to get through like a Hopkins level class for it. But at the same time, the Hopkins level class does give you like all the information and more where you're like, oh my gosh, this makes this a lot easier. Okay. So moving on to resources used, bought, and recommended. And Yubara will also chime in at the end or chime in throughout for any of the things that it's like she also used or didn't use. And because of our difference or like time difference in studying, I most likely used a lot more. You can kind of make that inference. UWorld tends to be the one that I recommend the most. I got it about a month and a half before my exam. The reason why I like UWorld is because it has a lot of practice questions. So to succeed on the MCAT, they typically recommend that you do at least 3,000. You do about 3,000 practice questions and 7 to 10 full-length exams. Your full lengths do count towards your practice questions. So if you do 10 full lengths, each full length is about 220 questions, then that would be 2,200 questions. um, a and with UWorld, I like them because their questions they tend to be harder than what you're actually going to encounter like on AMC and on your actual test day. Like I would say my like medium difficulty question I got on UWorld, or slightly harder difficulty, but not the absolute hardest, was the hardest question I encountered on my actual test day. The absolute hardest question I would get on UWorld, I don't think I ever got anything that hard on my actual test day. um Full lengths and section banks by AMC. The best way to study for something, especially when it's being written by a certain company is to understand that company as much as possible and understand exactly how they're going to write it, what they're going to do. If you're studying for an exam and there's two different chemistry professors, you're going to want to look at the back test for your professor because they may be different from the other one. So that's the same kind of logic you want to follow with like the MCAT, that the AAMC is the people who make the exam. So most likely, if you spend the most time with them, the more time you spend with them, the better you're going to do on the exam. So those ones I absolutely recommend. And I also mentioned here how there's this thing called the fee assistance program. I think you need to be about, it's either 3,000 or 4,000% below the poverty level, depending on the number of people in your family, is how you qualify for it. And it's a quick application that you fill out on AAMC that opens in the fall and um oh, opens in February. Sorry about that. And yes, if you get the Pell Grant, you should also get the fee assistance program. And that's something that I think is really crucial, not only for when you're taking the MCAT, but also for when you're applying. With the fee assistance program, you get a discounted MCAT, you get all of the full lengths and all of the section banks for free. Your MCAT is half the cost, and any reschedules or pushbacks are also half the cost. So that's like really nice. And then when you're applying to medical school, you can apply to up to 20 medical schools free of cost, and your secondary applications will also be free. And a lot of times when like if you get accepted, when they like tell you to come and visit for their in-person sessions, they'll also give you like discounts for that. So it tends to be really helpful with those like financial barriers. Um Anki Anki is kind of like app, this flashcard app that you can either use on your laptop or on your phone. I loved it because I love flashcards in general. It's like a nice, really like spaced repetition way of studying. I used it like religiously in the beginning of my studying. And then after I got through about like 1,000 of the 2,700 flashcards that were in there, I was like, okay, I can take a full length, and I didn't do as well. So I kind of like dwindled out with that and started doing a lot more practice questions. MCAT books, the MCAT books, Kaplan MCAT books, I got these. I used the 2019 to 2020 ones. I think so long as they're like plus or minus 3 within like the year that they were made, then you're still good to go. I got those for my brother, so they were technically free. Um, I just skimmed through I skimmed through all of them definitely, and then I looked thoroughly through the beginning of most of them. I really like the biochemistry and the psychology and sociology books, largely because I feel like with psychology and sociology, to do well on that, you kind of it's one of those things where it's like you just memorize a whole bunch of stuff. There's things that you do have to understand, but it's one of the only sections of the MCAT where I feel like this is like largely almost like a lot of parts are largely almost exclusively just like commit that to memory and figure out how you're going to commit that to memory. So I feel like just like seeing everything written out is really helpful. And also because psychology and sociology are there's not a lot of topics to cover within them. So every single topic in them ends up being high yield, that it's nice to just see it in a book format and kind of go through it and make sure that you like actually take note of everything. The Kaplan MCAT 528 book, that one I got on Amazon. I love that book. I think it's extremely helpful. I really like it because of the portability, largely because you can kind of just carry around one single book and have all of the subjects in there. It also includes test day tips. It also like has a link to it tells you like how to sign up for the Kaplan class, the Kaplan class. It's really just a free 220 question bank and one free full length exam that you can get with or without the book. But I like how it like shows you how to get there. That's one of the ones I would largely recommend if you want something that's kind of like almost like a condensed guide for, okay, how do I excel on the MCAT? Or what do I need to know to do well on the MCAT? That kind of covers both high yield and some like niche low yield subsections in those high yield subsections, in those high yield sections. Podcasts are the things I recommend the absolute most. They're my absolute favorite. They're so good for like passive studying. And as a neuroscience major, I do have to mention that it is a neuroscience fact that the more sensory modalities that you use in order to take in information, the more likely it is for that information to process and to actually make its way to your long-term memory. So trying to make sure that it's like not only are you seeing something, not only are you writing something and feeling something, but also that you're hearing something. So trying to incorporate a range of ways that you're interacting with the material. That's the way that you're going to like make sure that it kind of incorporates to you the best. I like to think of it as like eat, sleep, breathe MCAT, but not actually. MCAT question apps. There are some MCAT question apps that can be really useful for like doing like discretes on the go. The one that I used was MCAT Prep. I looked at it the other day and saw that it was no longer free. I'm sorry. I like the amino acid quiz app. And then UWorld also has an app. The only thing is UWorld is going to like make little section, kind of like mini question packs that have like actual like passages and some that have discretes. And at least when on the app, I didn't know how I could control it. So I'm not sure if you can control it. I think regardless, it's going to just mix them up. So that's the only thing I would say to prepare yourself for that if you're going to do UWorld on the go, you can do it on your phone, but just make sure that it's like you're actually giving it the attention that UWorld deserves. Um, the blueprint free full length. I also like that one. That's because it gave me just another full length to do. I did a total of 5 full lengths. So I did this one and then the 4 that were for that the AMC has. So that one's really good. I do recommend, however, at least 6. I or at least 6 full lengths or do like 2 to 3 like 2 to 3 full lengths worth of questions to supplement that additional full length. um MCAT Khan Academy. I think that's going to be one of your most important resources just for kind of getting information about like what you need to use, what you not what you need to use, just for kind of getting information, both high yield and low yield, about the concept that you're trying to understand. I would say that one is also really good because the way that it explains things, it's not explaining them in a way where it's like it's tailored towards the MCAT, but more so in a way where it's just tailored towards the subject. So you can kind of understand it in its organic essence and then take out what you need to know for the MCAT. And it also allows you to like actually like engage with the material because then you can do that extra step of like, okay, that's why that works that way. This is how this pertains towards actually the medicine and the MCAT. um, and agreeing with that, that the most of the questions on there are going to be like the kind of like the hardest discrete question you'll expect to see on the MCAT, largely because they tend to be like focused on that specific subject. And I feel like that applies especially when you're doing anything with chem phys or chemistry and physics for MCAT Khan Academy. The questions that they gave me, I would just always recognize, wow, this looks a lot harder than what I will actually do for like my practice exams or even on like practice question banks. And then this Jack Weston AMC MCAT science outline. I'll also drop this in the chat. It was one I saw the other day when I was looking through resources. So I didn't use this one, but what it does is it links YouTube videos for every science concept subsection for that the AAMC kind of outlines is going to be on the MCAT. And it links a YouTube video for that like same content area explaining what it is. So I think that's a good way to get your content review kickstarted if you don't know where to start. Sorry, that was like a 15-minute spiel.
I will tag on to the end of that with what I did. Pretty much all kind of contained in what Angel said, but I also highly recommend UWorld. I use that a lot as well. I stuck to mainly the AAMC practice tests because of the time constraint. I didn't really have time to do that many. So I think there's like 5 on there, 1 free, and then 4 that are free if you have the fee assistance or you could purchase. So I did all of the AAMC practice tests, and I just kind of used that to gauge where I was at. Another great thing about the practice tests, you can see like exactly what question you got wrong and like kind of why you got it wrong. Like they explain all the answer choices. So I highly suggest also like reflecting on the test that you do, like go back and see where you lost marks and why. And other than that, those were like my main 2. I used the Kaplan books. I believe it was 2020 to 2021. But like Angel said, like if it's somewhat recent, it should be all right. And that's kind of how I did my content review. And also like in terms of all these resources, it might seem overwhelming, but a lot of them cover different things. So be sure to kind of like split up what is just like content review. So like books or things that are just telling you the content versus like content recall, I guess I'd call it, is like Anki and stuff, where it's like more like you're engaging with the content, but it's still like just like definitions or like diagrams and stuff versus like practice questions that actually mimic the test. And I think once you start, you'll see that like the test is really worded in an interesting way, and like it could be like a passage about an experiment, and then from there it'll like try to get you to ask something or answer something about a topic. And that's like kind of unique. You won't get that from just like reading about the topic. So be sure to have a good amount of those types of resources as well. So like UWorld was like that for me, and like practice tests are going to do that. Yeah, I didn't use Anki a whole lot. I used it for Psych Soc because that's where I thought it would be most helpful, because you need a lot of those definitions, and like I was very unfamiliar with the terms. But like again, adjust as you wish. Like for example, I didn't feel like for chem and bio it was helping as much. I felt like the practice questions were helping me a lot more because it was so like experimental based when I actually did the practice tests. So see as you go. But I agree with all the resources Angel said. A lot of good stuff in there.
Yes. Wow. I think that's really ironic because I actually did not use Anki for Psych Soc more than like 10 flashcards, only because I started off, like I kind of went in order of sections. So I first did all of the Chem Phys ones, and I did all of the biochem ones. Well, then I did all of the biochem ones, chemistry, then physics, then biochemistry, then I did some biology ones. I was like, oh, I know like all of these now. And then when I saw that, oh, it wasn't working for those sections, I was like, oh, it's not going to work for anything. So exactly what Nubiris said, like pay attention to what resources will work better for what things. A lot of the times, like when it comes to things that are going to be just like rote memorization, flashcards are going to be the best, but also just like for like remembering information, it depends on also how you learn. If you know that you're one of those people who learn best when you actually look at a if you look at a tablet with all of your notes on it, or if you write down things in an actual like with a paper and a pencil, do that. Just pay attention to like the way that you learn, pay attention to yourself, pay attention to your brain. Notice like, oh, okay, I learned that yesterday and that worked really well. What did I do to do that? Making sure that you're doing that constant reflection is going to be one of the most important things. The people who excel or do the best on the MCAT tend to be the people who are paying the most attention to how they think and how they learn, and what's going to allow them to learn that information the best. 'Cause at the end of the day, it's a very hefty exam, and there's pretty much a 0% chance that you're going to be able to know every little thing that could be on it. And because of that, the best thing that you can do is you can make sure that you have a general and deep understanding of as many things as you can. And the best way to do that is to know yourself and to know the way that you think and learn. Okay. So next, we'll go into general tips that like we'll have to offer. Are there any questions beforehand? I don't see anything in the chat, so I think we're good to go. So for general tips, the biggest thing I would emphasize when it comes to preparing for the MCAT is to strategize and prioritize that strategy. So as I said earlier, like there is a 0% chance that you're going to be able to know, or maybe like a 0%, 0.1. It's very unlikely that you're going to be able to know every little thing that's going to be on the MCAT. Even people who get 528s, they can get a couple questions wrong. So it's going to be possible to like encounter a question where you see it and you're like, I have no clue where that came from. Happened to me at least 5 times on the exam. But the most important thing is that there are strategies that you can use to approach the MCAT and like you can have used to approach like MCAT style questions so that no matter what, you're going to be able to kind of like figure out what the actual answer is or take a strong educated guess at the very least. And the best way to like practice strategies is going to be to just practice. Like go over the strategies, make sure that you like you see how they work and what like the arrangement of how you're supposed to go about it for it to work. And then practice those with each practice question. It may be a time sink in the beginning when you start off with like using employing strategies for the exam, but towards the end it'll make or after like you get used to them, it'll get faster. Or even just like again, like pay attention to yourself if you notice that, oh, me and like this strategy don't work, but if I like reinvent it as this, it works perfectly. Don't be afraid to do that either. um and also start with understanding of concepts. If you can avoid memorizing things for as long as possible, I would say to do that. Psych soc, you kind of can't get away with that. And also for a lot of things in biochem, you kind of just got to commit those to memories. Even for chem phys, there are some equations that you just absolutely have to memorize. But the best thing to do is that it's like if you understand the way that something works, if you understand kind of like the processes, the derivations behind something, being able to memorize it will kind of come naturally and instinctually, or you'll even be able to like do the logical steps, like the correct steps of logic in order to reach like, okay, that's what that was. Kind of remember it. I would say that helps the most, especially in chem phys when it comes to like understanding equations versus just memorizing equations. That helped me a lot in terms of getting better at physics because I didn't have an extremely strong background in chemistry or physics, but I was like, oh, I have to learn this. And that helped me the most with that. And I think that kind of like segues perfectly into like review based on what you need the most. So in terms of like when how you're going to tailor your review is that the only time you should really be like doing a deep down, a deep like dive into any kind of content area should be after you recognize that, oh, I just don't know what this is, or I'm not understanding this, even though as I'm trying to like read up on it. And also that like kind of like flows into like don't have like such a set in stone schedule where it's like you can't kind of adjust along the way. Like having a relatively flexible schedule, but a good outline is going to be extraordinarily helpful for going about your studying, especially like as Nubira was mentioning, she studied for only a month. When you have only a month of time, your schedule is going to be a lot different than if you study for only 4 months. But at the same time, if you have it hammered down to like, oh, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z for 5 minutes, and then this for 3 minutes, and then this for 10 minutes. If you fall behind by 2 minutes, you're going to think your day is ruined. And that's not the best way to go about it. But also, like, it is good to have at least some kind of schedule because, like, when it came to my own studying, I was very lenient with how my schedule was going, which is why I had to eventually go like, okay, I actually can't do all of my like lab jobs and additional things I was doing outside of studying for the last month, because I realized, oh, I need to become a little bit more serious. um Other things are going to be try and retain everything as much as possible. Don't kind of like move on without understanding like how things tie into the human body and medicine. That's going to be the ultimate purpose of everything. And also, it'll make you more interested in it. If you're studying something and you see like, oh, this is like how this ties into health and disease, then you'll be like, oh, this is why I learned this in freshman year when I was crying after my chemistry exam, you know? Um, Amino acids should be your best friend. Like I would say those are probably one of the most important things. If I could mention anything that you should tackle first in your studying, it should be amino acids. And something that you should continue to tackle throughout the rest of your studying should be amino acids. Endocrinology and how it ties into behavior. There's actually a class at Hopkins called behavioral endocrinology that kept coming up on my exam. The endocrine system is actually surprisingly high yield on the MCAT. I would say it may be one of the most high yield organ systems on the MCAT. And um, how it interacts with the nervous system and how that ties into behavior. All of that is also really important. Even how the endocrine system interacts with all of the rest of the systems, all of the rest of the organ systems, because it does, is also very high yield. Um, Mitosis and meiosis, general cell cycle, quite high yield. um, in terms of other things, I would say make sure you also take notes on your correct and incorrect answers, making sure that you thoroughly review all of those, and that if you guess on something that you may not completely understand, make sure you take the time to review that just as much as you would review something that you just completely got wrong and you were like, oh, I just had no clue what that was. And then I would say probably like last most important things. Also, as a heads up, this is on the Canvas site. If you guys want to like look through and follow along or read more about anything on here. Last kind of like most important tip that I think I also said earlier is don't overestimate like how much you know about something when you're studying something. But again, don't like do any unnecessary deep dives. So make sure that you're doing enough review of both yourself and also being realistic with yourself so that it's like you can go in with confidence, but that you're also having enough humility to be like, oh, okay, I could actually know that better. And so that's everything for like general tips. Biggest one, definitely prioritize strategy.
I'll jump in with some tips as well. I mean, mainly what Angel said, highly agree. With the dynamic schedule, especially coming with like a month, like I kind of planned out the days I wanted to take practice tests, but I kept kind of what I would review kind of up in the air based on how the practice test went. So like if one score kind of dropped or something, I would change my study plan to focus on that more. And then that's another thing. Your progress might not be linear. Like I think my practice test, it went down at one point. That doesn't mean you're doing things wrong necessarily. Some practice tests are harder than others. Also, just kind of look at the type of questions or see like what you're getting wrong and just strategize based on that. Getting questions wrong on the practice test is kind of an opportunity because it's good. Now you know what you can work on to not get that wrong in the real test. So I don't think it's that bad to like, see a dip in scores in practice tests. I saw one. I think it's pretty normal. A lot of people see that. Another thing, like take breaks, especially if you're doing the 1 month, like the days I took practice tests, I'd kind of like not do anything else for the rest of the day because I was already so exhausted from like the 6-7 hour exam. Another thing for practice tests, mimic the conditions of the test. Like I even used it as a way, like from everything from like take the breaks like the same amount of time, do all that. I try not to like don't go on your phone during the breaks because you won't get your phone during the real one. Like really mimic it so that you're ready for test day. Even like try out new snacks during your practice test, just so that you're kind of in a familiar environment during the real test and you kind of know how things are going to go. So definitely like keep it the way it would be on a real test. One thing is like the MCAT doesn't allow you to use a calculator, so maybe get familiar with that if that's something that's difficult, like the mental math and stuff. One thing during the practice tests, on my scratch paper, I'd write down the question numbers that I was unsure about, just in case you're like unsure but you get it right, because there's so many questions you're not going to be able to keep track of it. So like when you review, even if you're trying to only review your incorrect answers, also review like the correct ones that you weren't so sure about, so like I could remember to go back to those. Another thing for UWorld, if you end up using UWorld, they have a lot of features other than just the questions. You can like save things in like a notebook or cue cards, and they have really nice like graphics to explain things, not just the question but just like a concept in general. You'll see like a really nice graphic about like a psychology concept or something, and you're able to save that in a notebook. So I actually kept notebooks for each subject, just to have those notes to be able to look back on those graphics instead of having to like dig through the thousands of questions to figure out where it was. So yeah, if you're paying for UWorld, might as well use all the features that it has. And yeah, and then just see what works for you. So like I said, like for Anki, it really only worked for me for Psych Soc. For UWorld, like the CARS questions weren't working for me as much. Like I felt like my score was kind of plateauing, and so I was all right with just keeping it there because I felt like putting more time into CARS wasn't giving me an output the way more time into other sections was. So really like strategize and prioritize the way you need to, and see where you're seeing improvement and where you think there's that like putting time into these sections is actually paying off when I do my practice tests versus where you feel like it's not as worth it. So I feel like you guys will get the hang of it as you go on and as you continue in your prep journey. We're also here if you ever need to like email us questions or like ask us anything. Angel and I are always available.
Just kind of like reiterating, like your review is going to be like the like crucial thing that determines like if you're actually going to do better after you did a set of questions, or if you're going to continue to do the same or plateau. It is also important to remember that it's like plateauing is not the end of the world. It's just important that it's like you reflect and you figure out like, okay, why is my score maxing out here and what can I do to do better? If you're plateauing, but your score is at a 130 in every section, I think you're fine. But if you're plateauing and you're like sub 125, sub 126, then there are other things that then it's like there are like a lot of concrete things like you can do where you're like, okay, there is a good amount of things that I could be doing right now. I may be missing content. I may just be not understanding the way that questions are being worded. Harder questions might be like harder for me. There are times where people tend to like get a whole bunch of like the easier difficulty questions wrong than the hardest questions correct. And that could also be that you're just overthinking, that naturally you are a good thinker, but when it comes to things that are easier, you are overthinking it and then thinking yourself into the wrong answer. So paying attention to those things, as Nubira said, like UWorld, they give you a summary of diagnostic information that lets you know like when you're essentially tells you about like how your actual like performance was, how it compared to others, also like what types of questions you're getting wrong, what are the commonalities in that. So like if you have a software that does that for you, that's like killer, that's saving you so much time. But also make sure you're paying enough attention to that, so when it's like when you go to AAMC and you have to now essentially be that software for yourself, like you're also able to pick up on those same similarities and all those things that it's like is holding, could be holding your score back. So noticing that like, oh, I got all of these things about central dogma incorrect. I know what I need to study tonight.
Another quick thing, a tip I forgot about like wellness in general. At first, I kind of had the mindset that like, okay, this is my like crunch time month of studying, like that's all I'm gonna do, and that like quickly failed, and like I felt burned out and tired. So feel like make sure to keep some hobbies. keep time for things that matter and people that matter. I think at first I was shutting people out and I was like, this is my month of studying, like no one texts me, and that didn't really work out for the better. So like, obviously you need to budget your time accordingly, but like when I saved time for like spending time with family because I was home when I was studying, or like texting my friends and stuff, that helped me get my mind off of the test at times, and that was very helpful. So like, you have all these people who are a great like resource and just like great people to connect with. So keep that in mind. It's refreshing to have like conversations that have nothing to do with the MCAT, or to talk to people who know nothing about the MCAT. Like it's great. So don't shut out your parents and siblings and stuff. I would say keep that stuff going, because I think with the 1 month you might feel like a lot of pressure, but having those times where you can like not have to worry about the MCAT is also good. You kind of want your brain to decompress during certain periods. So like stopping to just like listen to music, talk to people. Like one of my hobbies is like rollerblading. I like made sure to do that a little bit every other night or something. So like keep those up. I think that's also really important so that you don't burn out.
Yes. I actually during my studying I took up yoga and Pilates, and I've kept it up since, because at the end of the day it's like you need a way to relieve yourself, and to also like remember that it's like at the end of the day you're still a human being and you're still a person, and people care about you. You have friends. You had a life before the MCAT and you'll have a life afterwards. And it's important to like kind of recognize that it's like just because you are taking a very important exam though doesn't mean that it's like you can be awful to all of the people around you. So make sure that it's like you're transparent with them. You let them know like, oh, I'm studying for this exam. It's causing me a lot of stress. Like also let people be your support system. Let people help you. I would say if there was anything I regret the most throughout my studying, it was like how I did like kind of like I isolated myself a lot of the time just because I was like, oh, I just need to study this. And I felt like nobody else was. I mean, none of my friends were studying for the MCAT. And every time I would go around them, I would just make MCAT analogies that they would not welcome very much. So I did like go through a period of isolation. And I feel like if you kind of pace out your studying and you also just remember to give yourself grace, that you don't have to, like, it doesn't have to be that grueling. It doesn't have to feel like you're making a world's end or a world saving sacrifice by like to study for the MCAT. That doesn't have to be a thing, which I think kind of segues perfectly into like day of test taking strategy tips in general, just like wellness tips. Like for the high yield topics, you guys can review that. It's on the actual Canvas page. um but for like on the actual day where you're taking the test, what's going to be the most important is going to be you. Even throughout your entire studying process, what's going to be the most important is going to be you, making sure that from the beginning and to the end, you don't lose yourself by studying. And that you come out of your studying kind of feeling like you've gained a deeper understanding of all of the things that you've been doing throughout your entire like pre-med career. So you want to come out of it knowing like, oh, okay, the MCAT has taught me this, and this, and I know how it applies to medicine in X, Y, and Z way. Though it's like 9 times out of 10, the average person, once they take the MCAT, they will never have to worry about it again. So that's another thing you can even look forward to. And like actual like on the day of, in terms of tips, what I would say is definitely take all of your breaks. Take all of your breaks. Kind of going back to like um simulating testings, like actual settings when you're doing practice exams. Make sure that you're like actually doing make sure that you're taking your breaks during your practice exams. Make sure that you try and have a meal during your practice exam. Do any of that. Like make sure you like make it feel as real as possible, but also make sure that it's like you're taking the breaks to give your brain like some mental rest, and you have time to kind of like debrief wash away that last section and prepare yourself for the next session. Halfway through, you have a 30-minute break. Take all 30 minutes. Don't ignore that break. I would say this is also one that's really important. One question will not make or break your score, but allowing it to affect you for the rest of your exam will affect the rest of your exam and will affect your score. Like there was immediately as soon as I finished my Chem Phys section, I was trying to change an answer because I realized at the very last second, oh wait, I actually know what the correct answer is, and it's not the one I picked, and the test closed out. It's absolutely okay. Like you'll still do well. Like don't get hung up. Just be able to kind of like wash away like past things and continue to move forward. Which kind of like adds into like going to the test calm and level-headed. Don't go in like hyperactive. Don't drink like 18 cups of coffee. Don't do anything that kind of takes you away from your regular schedule. You want it to feel almost like you're going into the lecture hall. Like it wants to be as calm as possible. You don't want to over arouse your body. Think of like Yerkes Dodson and the optimal arousal theory. You don't want to over arouse yourself and then no longer be in that optimal aroused range where your success will be the largest. And I think that's the biggest thing. Like at the end, when you're doing your reviews, when you're looking over your questions, make sure that your answer choice is actually answering the question and that it's not just an answer choice that's there. A lot of times you'll see people say that it's like almost everything on the MCAT is correct, but it's just like factually correct. Like it's something that could happen, but it's not pertinent to what is being asked because that's how it's going to exist in medicine. If there's something that's absolutely irrelevant to like the person's like illness, like they may give you like 18 different things and only 3 of those things are actually important to that illness. You have to be able to hone in on those 3 things and focus on that alone. So being able to kind of like make sure that you're paying attention to what's important, that you can also eliminate what's not important is going to be something that you can use throughout your entire medical career and medical journey. And I've now talked for a very long time. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. For Nubaira, you can chime in. Or we can end and you guys can see me in 3 minutes. Comments, concerns. Give me a 6 in the chat if you're good to go, you have no questions, and you're done. So, where can we access this document? It is on the Canvas page. And actually, Nubaira, you know the exact directions. Can you?
Yeah, so it's not in modules. You have to go to files. And then under files, I think it's like MCAT resources and tips is the folder, and then it'll be in there. It's called Angels something, Angels resources or Angels tips or something. Angels MCAT tips, I think. But it's in the files tab, not the modules.
I wonder if I can also share it here. I think I just shared it, but to Miss Campbell's room.
Oh, thank you so very much. This was so interesting. And I think our students have the information they need in order to construct a successful schedule. And so if you found the information helpful today, I want you to put your thumbs up. Is there one thing that you are walking away from after hearing? Can you please place that in the chat? I think that will help Angel and Nubaira to have a better idea of how to support you going forward. So thumbs up if you found the information helpful. And if there's any one particular thing you're going to take away from this, we're going to ask that you place that in the chat. So one person found it helpful. Okay, thank you.
Isolate yourselves from humanity. Yeah, that's really the biggest one. That's really the biggest one. Also,
Absolutely.
people will remember that you cut them off for an exam. That one I didn't anticipate. They will come back and ask you about that. So, you can, but just prepare. Just be prepared.
And the recording will be provided to you. So if it should be all on the Canvas page.
Okay, that's perfect. So we are at 7 o'clock on the dot, which is when our organ system session is due to start. So I will go over there and hop on that and set that up. For that, well, we can talk about that when we get there. But I will see you guys shortly. Nubira won't be there. So
I'll see you tomorrow.
gotcha.
Oh, it's the same Zoom link.
Oh, the
Yeah,
same
you can stay in this one.
Okay, perfect.
I'll see y'all tomorrow. Thank you guys.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Give me exactly 1 minute to get everything set up. Okay, so today, the way that I wanted to structure this was that I recognized just how much content kind of really goes into all of the organ systems. And while I do have a packet for each organ system, I think it would be better that we kind of focus on what you guys think would be the most helpful. So in terms of topics we can cover, the ones I have listed are going to be right here. Okay. So these are the types of packets I have available. What I wanted to do was I wanted to know in the chat which ones would be most helpful of the bolded ones, because those ones are the highest yield ones. Nice. Respiratory, circulatory, nervous, nervous or endocrine, nervous, endocrine, nervous, nervous and endocrine. Okay, so the ones I see the most are nervous and endocrine. And as a strong proponent of as a neuroscience major, I will start with nervous then, and then we can also do endocrine afterwards. Or circulatory or respiratory. Okay. Okay. Can you guys see this properly? Me like a thumbs up or yes. Okay, perfect. Okay. So for this first question I have for you guys is, would you prefer I go through kind of would you prefer I go through step by step? Do you guys want to like interact with this like actively? Do you want to go into breakout rooms and then go through each lesson and then come back at the end? I guess what I can do is for oh, just go through. Okay. So okay, I'll run through the main content pieces and then I will also we'll do practice questions together. And then at the very end, there's two practice passages. So hopefully if we can get to at least one of the practice passages and then another content area also right afterwards. So what is membrane potential? So your resting membrane potential, that's going to be the voltage, which is just going to be the electric potential difference. So the difference in electric potentials at the sides of the membrane, like across. So the membrane potential is going to be the voltage across a neuron of a resting neuron. It's typically affected by concentration gradients of ions across the membrane and membrane permeability of each ion. And it tends to vary, but typically you tend to see it at around negative. You tend to see it about negative 30 millivolts. Negative 30 to 90 negative 90 millivolts. So as I was said previously, the resting membrane or the resting membrane potential or membrane potential, those are interchangeable. But the resting membrane potential of a neuron is also largely affected by, in addition to concentration gradients, it's also largely affected by the permeability of each ion type. So in terms of the permeability of the membrane to ions, the plasma membrane, as you guys know, we have our phospholipid bilayer. with our hydrophobic head and our hydrophobic tails, or hydrophilic tails. So that hydrophobicity of the plasma membrane it doesn't like hydrophilic, so water liking, very polar molecules to be passing through. So if I had to break it down into a likes and hates list, I would say what it's going to like is it's going to like those hydrophobic molecules. And here is, sorry guys. Here is I'll drop this in the chat so you guys can also actively follow along. Sorry about that. If I had to break it down into a likes and a hates, I would say they like hydrophobicity, they hate hydrophilic molecules. So that hydrophilic, so anything that's really going to be your polar molecules, except for there are some like very small polar molecules that can pass through. But anything polar, anything charged ions, typically they're not going to be able to just freely pass through like a form of passive, non-facilitated passive diffusion, but it's you also typically be able to see that when it comes to like molecules that are able to freely pass, you tend to have like your large cholesterol, large lipids, or even short chain fatty acids. Those are able to kind of pass through. A lot of your hormones are able to kind of directly act on cells if they are cholesterol or lipid derived hormones. So, and because of this kind of like hate, what you tend to see is that you will have either pumps or channels, protein pumps or protein channels that will allow for the necessary ions and things to pass through that won't be able to pass through just on their own. So again, voltage at resting, it can range anywhere from -90 to -30 millivolts. But what you tend to see the most common for neurons, like human neurons, is -70. So you have some common ions. You have a few common ions like you're going to see pretty much at kind of every single um, at every single neuron that's going to be driving their concentration gradient. Sometimes these concentrations can be different depending on the cell and the surrounding environment, but the general distribution for them is that for sodium, that tends to be higher outside of the cell. For potassium, that tends to be higher inside of the cell. I guess I don't have to the cell. They're inside. Chloride and calcium are going to follow that same pattern where chloride is going to be higher outside and calcium is, or chlorine is going to be higher outside, and calcium is going to be higher outside. And leak channels. So in addition to, there's going to be some things that are, in addition to the concentration gradients, we're kind of building off of the concentration gradients that are responsible for maintaining that resting membrane potential of -70. There's things that are going to mainly contribute to those concentration gradients, and their general distribution is also going to be leak channels and the sodium potassium pump. So the leak channels, these tends to be your potassium leak channels. What these are going to do is these tend to be always open and they allow ions to flow down their concentration gradient. Specifically, we tend to see this a lot with the movement of potassium from like inside to outside of the cell to kind of maintain that negative level, negative resting membrane potential. You just think of that as passive diffusion, and then K plus to the resting membrane potential. Then the sodium potassium pump, or NAK AT pace, which is what it's also known as. So this is going to work through actually active diffusion, where it's going to consume ATP and it's going to push both potassium and sodium against their concentration gradients to make sure that that resting membrane potential is maintained. And the best way to kind of remember what direction you're going in is also going to be to make sure you remember, like, what are the general ion distributions of sodium and potassium. So if you can remember that, oh, that sodium potassium AT NAK AT pace is implying that it's going to be the sodium potassium pump. That's going to mean active diffusion going against their concentration gradients. And we know that sodium is higher outside of the cell. So most likely we're pumping sodium outside of the cell. Also, it'd be doing the opposite of what the leak channels are going to be doing. And what this is going to do is it will consume one molecule of ATP in exchange for sending 3 NA 3 Na out, 2 A in. I like to say it as 3 Nout, 2 Kin, just so that it kind of like rings a lot easier. So 3 Nout, 2 Kin. You can also kind of remember it by like and sodium has more letters than the abbreviation for sodium has more letters than the abbreviation for potassium. So it's therefore going to have the higher number and the word with more letters. So Na will correspond to 3 and out. K will correspond to 2 and in. um So for how do the sodium potassium AT-PACE ion concentration differences in leak channels work together to set the resting membrane potential? Best way to think about that is just to think about how everything is going to be moving in terms of concentration gradients. So since our sodium potassium pump is going to be transporting 3 sodium outside of the cell for every 2 potassium that it's bringing into the cell, it's going to be directly contributing to the resting membrane potential by making the inside more negative than the outside. And the only other downside to that is that the sodium potassium pump is going to primarily maintain the sodium potassium gradients, which are going to create the membrane potential as sodium potassium move across their gradients through leak channels. And then the additional purpose of the leak channels are to help with maintenance of that resting membrane potential, and it's going to help ultimately create that negative resting potential. And then with the ion concentration differences, it really is just going to be if you have a higher concentration of positive charges on the outside than on the inside, that you'll be at a net negative. You can also kind of think of it as the additional assistance of the potassium leak channels is that if we're pumping 3, if we're pumping 2 potassium in for every 3 sodium that we're going to send outside of the cell, to further contribute to that negativity, if our potassium is also like leaking to the outside simultaneously as it's being pumped in, it's going to create kind of like a net negative where we're still going to have we're still going to be able to have significantly more positive charge on the outside than we're going to have on the inside. Okay, are you guys ready for practice questions? There's just 2. Thumbs up, yes. Thumbs down, no. I don't understand anything you said. Do a 6 for a thumbs up or an actual thumbs up reaction. Okay. Okay. I'm thinking you clarify what the leak channels do again? Yes, so the leak channels, they're going to act as regular protein channels. So kind of like your standard way of thinking of a protein channel is what your leak channel is going to be like. Typically you see them drawn kind of like hot dogs, where your thing goes like that. They can just kind of flow in versus out of the cell. And essentially what the leak channels are going to do is they're going to allow potassium, so that kind of positive potassium charge, to leak from the inside of the cell, those positive potassium ions to leak from the inside of the cell because that's where they have a higher concentration, to go to the outside of the cell. So they're going to directly contribute to the resting membrane potential because they're letting go of those positive charges and sending them out into the outside. Is going to create a net negative, contribute to the net negative difference. Another thing that tends to be really helpful about the potassium leak channels is during action potentials, when our sodium potassium pump is inactivated, a large thing that's going to immediately try to restore our resting membrane potential is going to be our potassium leak channels. Yeah, no problem. What is the purpose of Cl minus? So calcium and chloride, they tend to function in kind of like niche areas of, like, they tend to have their own like specific functions, but in terms of generally for resting membrane potential, what you can think of chloride is, they tend to be like, these are in significantly less. These are significantly less present compared to sodium and potassium. Generally, the concentration of Cl minus can also contribute to action potentials, and it is also going to contribute to just that resting membrane potential because of the potential difference. So Cl minus it's a negatively charged ion. It's going to have a higher concentration outside than the inside. So that can also largely create, that can actually move outside and create an action potential. It's going to be its contribution. Ca2 plus, positively charged, very small, a lot smaller concentrations, also because it's a larger ion than both sodium and potassium. But that one tends to kind of function similarly. There are some calcium gated channels. So you tend to hear a lot about your voltage gated sodium channels and potassium channels. There are some chloride and calcium channels. Their function isn't as involved when it comes to just like the resting membrane potential. I feel like they tend to function more as kind of like cofactors and essential functions for like actual like intersynaptic communication between neurons. Did that answer your question? I don't. Okay, thank you. I would say, in terms of like largest takeaways, or what's going to be the most important for you to know for the exam, will be the role of the sodium potassium pumps, this distribution of ions at the membrane, how potassium leak channels work, and kind of just what generally the resting membrane potential is. Okay. Are we ready for some practice questions? I don't know if I can create one. Okay, for this one, I'm trying to see, would you guys, there's only 2 questions, so would you guys prefer that for the very first set of questions, we just go through them, and then for the next set of questions, then you can try the breakout rooms? Oh, okay. Um, let's see. So I'm don't think I can make a poll. So what I will say is someone has already sent me their answer. So maybe you can just privately message me what your answers for the 2 questions are. And we can give it until 7:30 2 or 7:33. I'll give you guys 2 minutes to answer both. Okay, 30 seconds left. Okay, so now I'll start going over it. I think I got answers from at least half. Feel free to, I mean, now I'm going to start going over it so you could say it in the, you can say it out in the chat if you would like. From what I see, it does look like we have a larger consensus for 2 than 1. So starting for 1, which term describes the cell membrane potential of a neuron at rest? So for this one, I can't see the winning answer, but there was a distribution of answers going through kind of like each one. Polarized, this is actually correct. That's the correct answer. And that's because if you think about what even polarization is, it just means that there's a charge difference, or there's a difference in the distribution of charges. And that's exactly what the neuron is. It's going to have a polarized membrane that is going to have a different distribution of charges. Depolarized. So depolarized is what happens when we're actually kind of making our way towards an action potential. So depolarized tends to be is when you become more positive. Hyperpolarized is going to be the exact opposite. This is kind of like right after the action potential. This is when it becomes more negative, repolarized. This one I've actually never seen as a term used to categorize neurons. So unless they're being depolarized, like they're having another action potential after their refractory periods. Okay, I can also do that. I just got a direct request asking me to draw the action potential. I'm trying to make sure I don't have a drawing of here actually throughout it, which I don't. So if I was to draw an action potential, the way that I would depict it would be that I would have a graph like this. Over here, this will be the voltage, the membrane voltage on the side. And then this you can kind of think of like your standard X timeline. And here you will kind of start like at your resting membrane potential. Then you have your, just going to be about -70. And then here you would have your threshold. Which will be about -50. And then here is where you tend to have where it like you have your max of your action potential, which tends to be anywhere from 30 to 40 millivolts positively. Typically you see 30. um and the way that the graph would look would be something kind of like this. So that's probably the best. So you'll start at -70. You'll also probably tend to see things like this, where these are like failed attempts because they didn't reach that -55 threshold. And then action potentials tend to be like all or nothing effects, where they'll either the entire thing will happen or it won't happen at all, which is why you see this kind of like skyrocket to well above 30. And the biggest thing with to take away from this is also going to be this kind of like undershoot period, where afterwards we have this refractory period where we kind of go too far into the negative. And at that time period, we're not going to be able to summon any other action potentials. the biggest thing, at least in terms of our last question, is this is going to be depolarization. This is going to be hyperpolarization. Repolarization is what I assume, or what could be thought of as like an actual potential that would occur. We're trying to kind of get yourself back from this refractory period. So as we're going up here, this is still hyper in this whole term. Is known as the refractory period. There's different types of refractory periods. That's supposed to be a 30 positive. So it's going to go from like a whopping -70 all the way up to a 30 positive value. There's different types of refractory periods. That is not, you don't need to go that much into the weeds of neuroscience for the MCAT. That one I actually never encountered on my exam. So I can say with confidence, it's not something that you absolutely need to know. um, and for question 2, well, I guess first I'll say, does everyone understand why A is correct now? Did that diagram help? Okay, thumbs up. Okay, question 2, how are potassium ions typically moved out of a neuron when the neuron is at rest? The most common answer choice I saw for this was D. So we'll go through these one by one. So A, electrical gradients move potassium ions out of the cell. So this is wrong. Can anyone chime in and tell me why super quickly? Okay. Well, the reason why this is wrong is because this says electrical gradients and it's supposed to be concentration gradients. Concentration gradients. Potassium is positive, but potassium is positively charged, but also is sodium is also negatively charged and calcium is also negatively charged. So potassium isn't the only positively charged ion. It is the only ion with a higher concentration inside than outside of the cell. The rest are higher outside. The sodium potassium pump moves potassium ions out of the cell. Remember how we say it? We say 3 now. 2 kin. So 2 are going to be moving. 2 are going to be moving inside of the cell. Whereas Na is what's going to be moving outside of the cell. C, potassium ions are stable and do not move when a membrane is at rest. This is also false because largely because it does not necessarily have to do with the stability of potassium ions, but if this is being rephrased as potassium stability in terms of potassium being stable versus mobile, then this is also still wrong because of our potassium leak channels, which are going to largely contribute to our resting membrane potential. It's, I would say, important to know that they both work for the resting membrane potential because it is a crucial, it's a crucial characteristic that's going to contribute to the resting membrane potential. Like, it would be completely disrupted without potassium leak channels. It would be completely, almost completely wiped out without the sodium potassium pump. So both things are largely important, and the channels and the channels, the pumps, none of that will work if the concentration gradients also don't exist. And you can think of it as like the electrical gradient is created by, so that electrical potential difference is what the is what the resting membrane potential difference is, but that is a result of the concentration gradients, not the other way around. Okay. And we have 15 minutes left. So I'll ask you guys this. Would you want to go through the electrical properties of a neuron and action potentials, or would you rather do in practice passage and go over this? Okay, passage. I see a lot of PMs for passage. So what I'm thinking for the passage is that we can kind of do it standard MCAT drill style, and we can put you guys into breakout rooms for 7 minutes, and then because you guys all have the document, and then come back and convene at about 7:55 so that we can go through the questions. How does that sound? Thumbs up? Thumbs down? Okay. No one hates the breakout room idea. Okay, perfect. Okay, what I'll do. There's 20 of us here, so I can do 4 breakout rooms. Or there's 18. So maybe 3 breakout rooms. Okay, how did everyone enjoy the passage? Do we like it? Thumbs up or a 6 in the chat if we liked it. Thumbs down or a 9 in the chat if we hated it. Thumbs up. This okay, beautiful. So starting off with passage highlights, this is the very first passage we're doing together. I'll kind of just like walk through how to generally approach looking at a science passage on the MCAT. So there's always different types of passages you can get on the MCAT. tends to be broken down into like research paper, like a primary research, or I'll probably just leave generally a research paper or a textbook, where research paper, you're going to be dealing with kind of break this. We have this acronym called BGMR, where the B is going to stand for background. There's going to be like background information from like background content information. G is going to be goals. Another way to think of goals are also going to be the hypothesis. M is going to be methods, and R is going to be results. Largest difference between these two is that your textbook will most likely only have a background, versus your primary research paper is going to have background, goals, methods, and results. Every once in a while in a textbook paper, you may have some more things, but for the most part, textbook ones, they're non-experimental and they're just telling you about a disease type rather than actually going into like an experiment that people did. So when it comes to actually like what you should highlight and what you should also do, another thing I'll add is that B can also stand for buzzwords. And MCAT buzzwords really are just like words that signify, oh, we're going over some type of important content. Or we're talking about like content right here rather than we're just talking about something that's core information from the passage. So looking at this, looking at the first paragraph, some things that would stand out to me to highlight would be neuromuscular junction, probably also highlight synapse. I'd highlight ACH and neurotransmitter acetylcholine, largely because it's anything in parentheses that has an acronym, I always highlight when it comes to the science section passages, just because like understanding what each of those acronyms means can get kind of tricky. You can also, you get a notepad on your exam, so you can also doodle that out. After a, and then I'd highlight muscle contraction, and then I'd probably add enzyme prevents sustained muscle contraction. Acetylcholinesterase, if I need to know exactly what the name of the enzyme is, I can just quickly go back and look because I know, oh, there's an enzyme that prevents muscle contraction. The kind of the way that you want your highlights to be is like you want them to be in a way where they tell you, you can kind of read your highlights and also get like a full glimpse of what the passage is. So another way that I would, so because of all of this, I'd say all of my highlights in green are background. This is probably also more background. So myasthenia gravis, I would highlight that just so I know what it is. I'd get that. I'd highlight autoantibodies just so I know that, oh, this is like something that is autoimmune. I would get competitively inhibit just in case we start talking about any kind of like enzyme interactions. I know like, oh, there was competitive inhibition in the way that it works. And then I'd highlight the abbreviation again. And then you can kind of just landmark that because the rest of the passage is kind of just describing what's going to happen. I'd probably also highlight hallmark findings just so I know where my hallmark, where I would look to figure out what the symptoms of myasthenia gravis are. Again, I would get the abbreviation and the actual word highlighted. And then diagnose myasthenia gravis just so I know what that is. This still feels like there's also like background. This is telling me about what the test is. And then I would highlight this, the reproducible decrease in amplitude between first, fourth, or fifth, considered diagnostic, just so I know what it actually means and making sure that I'm picking up on things that are like largely important for me to understand what was happening in the passage. I would also probably add acetylcholinesterase inhibitors for treatment. We've only talked about one disease, so I don't need to keep highlighting myasthenia gravis, as I know that's the disease we're talking about. And then I'd highlight this. Because it's telling me just like how it's working, how they're actually being able to treat it. And then finally, we are moving into the rest of our GMR. So we get a researcher is studying the effect of neostigmine, and pyridostigmine on individuals with myasthenia gravis. So goal is they're studying effect of these drugs on people with this disease. That's their, and whenever you see goals, you can kind of anticipate that very soon you're about to see methods in terms of how they actually went about those goals. And then they tell us to do so. He conducts a study. They were previously diagnosed, and they say 300 subjects randomly assigned, 3 treatment groups. And then they go some more into methods And one of the most important ones is going to be actually how you determine effectiveness of it. So effectiveness measured by improvement of neuromuscular transmission. And we know that we're using a negative RSN test. And then we have our figure here. Whenever you see a figure, I would say don't give yourself more than 5 to no more than 20 minutes, no more than 20 seconds that you're going to spend looking at it. I wouldn't spend more than like 5 to 10. I'd probably just glance at it, see if there's anything important I can take away from it. I noticed like, oh, there's like some trends that I could probably observe. Some other things like you want to take note of are there error bars? Are there error bars? Are there stars? Largely because of when you're doing figure analysis. There's another acronym that we use that I can go into later because we're already 10 minutes over time. But there's another thing that you want to do where you want to look for significance. You want to be able to extract the story. So if there are error bars or if there are stars or are there any indications of significance, those are things that I would want to immediately pay attention to. For this figure, because it's kind of just like a summary diagram, I kind of just like look at it and keep going. I revisit it if I'm largely confused, but that's about it. Okay. Now going through. How does that feel? When you guys did your highlights, did they match up? Do you think that they were largely different? Do you like the whole breaking it down by background, goals, methods, results? Or, okay, I see some thumbs up, so I'm gonna hope that you guys all feel that same sentiment. It's a shared sentiment. Okay, going through each question. So since you guys spent time in breakout rooms going through, does anyone want to, I guess maybe just like drop in the chat or unmute and tell me what you guys like talked about in your breakout rooms and what you have. We can kind of go we can go by each question. There was 3 breakout rooms, so we can just do breakout room 1 can do question 1 and 4. Breakout room 2 can do 2 and 5. And breakout room 3 can get question 3, which I think is the best question. Okay. I'm getting some PMs already, so that's good. But I guess anyone from breakout room 1, if you could either unmute or say in the chat what you were thinking or what you guys like talked about, or if you guys even got to the question. If you didn't get to the question, you can also say that. Okay, so I'm seeing like you guys didn't get to discuss. I do see that there was some confusion. I see that people were they had a consensus on preventing, but destabilize versus stabilize, which was confusing. Okay, so looking at that one, what is the mechanism by which anti-AChR antibodies prevent signal transmission in the motor neuron when bound to AChR? So what I will, okay, I did see that you guys talked about some of your highlighting strategies. So I guess that we can also talk about those. Or you guys can say that in the chat while I walk through this. But for this one, they told us in the passage that these are working through a process of competitive inhibition. To prevent ACH binding. And at your neuromuscular junction, you do have, or your NMJ, you have ligand gated, I believe, sodium channels that will open in response to binding of the they'll open in response to binding of acetylcholine to the acetylcholine receptor. So they are going to be, and that's going to then trigger that will trigger a series of downstream signal events that will also ultimately lead to an action potential. So since we're having an action potential at the neuromuscular junction, depolarization is going to be correct. The other reason I like this question is that it also provides a perfect example of when you can kind of do that kind of like two-part method of where it's like you can kind of choose one part of the question to tackle, one part of the answer choice to tackle, and then you can leave it up to chance for the rest. So for this, now since we know it's depolarization, we can rule out B and C because those both say hyperpolarization. And then the real question is just like stabilizing versus destabilizing. Are we going to be stabilizing the membrane or destabilizing the membrane? You're going to be stabilizing the membrane. You can kind of think of it as like stability makes, when things are stable, they're happy. They're not going to be doing anything else. They're not going to be reactive. They're not going to be trying to do anything else. They're not going to be primed to kind of engage in things. Kind of think of it as like organic chemistry. Think of some orgo. But when things are unstable, that's when they're going to want to move towards that state of stability. So they're going to be highly reactive, doing a lot of things. They're going to want to do something. So that by binding to the by preventing the binding of ACH, they are stabilizing the postsynaptic membrane. Also, it's just more stabilized when something is bound. So the answer is destabilization. For question 2, does anyone want to unmute? We're already like almost 20 minutes over. So yes, that's perfect. I guess for all groups 1, 2, and 3, just let me know what your answers for were each one, and I'll go through them. I agree. I got a PM from Sophie who said 20 to 30%. I agree. That's the correct answer for that. So 2 was asking us to look at figure 2. And they wanted to know what are the false negative results for RNS. You can kind of gauge the false negatives precisely by this word right here, placebo. Our placebo, if you ever heard of like the placebo effect, basically it's going to be a medication that does absolutely nothing. Most of the time, it's just like a sucrose pill that they give to people. So anything that happens as a result of people with the placebo drug, you can kind of rule that out as to like essentially like false test results, almost like randomness. So a false negative test result that's going to come from our placebo groups, which we see is always about 20 to 30% based off of where the blue kind of lines up. It's always in that 20 to 30% range. Okay. And the rest of these just don't match up. Based on findings in figure 2, did anyone have anything for 3? B. Okay, I got 2 B's from Joshua and Sophia. Great job. Do either of you want to potentially unmute and explain how you got that? You can also just tell me no, and that'll be okay. Anyone who got
I can try.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I put shorter onset because for neostigmine, which was the red, it
Mhm.
like peaked high, like it grew first before the green. Like it got to 90% before. So the onset, that's why, like I said, it had a shorter onset because I guess it got to that peak faster. And then it also had a shorter duration because um it like decreased faster than the green one did. So the green one stayed at a peak for a longer time than the red one did.
Exactly. That's perfect. That was a perfect figure analysis. So yes, it peaked out faster than the green, so shorter onset, and then it faded out afterwards significantly faster than the green faded out. Or at least we never see the green fade out. So I fully agree with that. And since the rest of these are kind of just like opposites in different ways, you can also rule that out. There's another place where you can apply that like 2-type strategy where it's like, okay, I know for a fact that the duration is longer for the other one. That would, for for P, I know that the duration for P is longer. So you know that, okay, that means I can only have C and B or C, and then you can go from there. Which of the following types of anyone for 4? What did people get for 4? Probably didn't get to 4. That was like a relatively short time. But for 4, which of the following types of neurons describe the presynaptic neuron in figure 1? So we have a motor neuron going to a muscle cell, a motor cell at the neuromuscular motor movement junction, meaning we have a motor neuron. Because it's involved in movement, it's a motor neuron. So you can rule out your sensories. Afferent and efferent, the way that I like to remember them is that afferent, they're going to arrive at the brain. Efferent, they're going to exit the brain. They're going to exit the brain. Just remember afferent equals arrive, efferent equals exit. And since we're exiting the brain and going to a neuromuscular junction, we know that we have an efferent motor neuron. Also, all of your sensory neurons are going to be afferent. All of your motor neurons are going to be efferent. Okay. Myasthenia gravis affects which division of the nervous system? Does anyone have any guesses? I can also kind of umbrella this out and draw it out. Or an answer choice. I know that was something we actually did not talk about. Mhm. Let me try this out. Let's see. Okay, so there's nothing there for the, I don't see anything in the chat, so I'll kind of just quickly do this one. So myasthenia gravis affects which division of the nervous system? We're affecting the neuromuscular junction. And it's talking about motor movement. Because we're affecting the neuromuscular junction motor movement, and it's going to be at a largely the biggest one is going to be neuromuscular junction. We know that we're going to be in the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system, you have your somatic and your autonomic. And then you have two more divisions, which are going to be your parasympathetic and sympathetic. I feel like the ones that people tend to confuse the most are somatic and sympathetic. So just remembering that your somatic is going to be your voluntary and skeletal and muscle, and that everything with your autonomic nervous system is going to be involuntary and largely just smooth and cardiac muscle. Based off of that, we're affecting our neuromuscular junction. Our answer is B. Okay, and you're quite a bit over time. How does that feel? I will post all of the other packets I have so that you guys can go through them as well. I can also share this document, the one that I wrote on. In terms of just like the notes, so that you guys have those as well. Share the answers of packets. Yes, absolutely. In fact, what I can do right now is I can attach the answer packet instead. I'll attach the answer packet and then I'll upload what I'll attach both.